Oh, hello there. I'm Kat, a wonderful professor of math. And today I'm inviting you to join me in the exciting world of fractions, decimals, and percents. There's a percent on my pillow. It says right there, 70% finest Croco. Let's find out what's in here and why it's moving. Why, by golly, there's a chocolate frog in my pillow. That's probably why it's 70% Croco. I'm going to be giving you the magic key you need to unlock the secrets behind comparing between and converting between these different ways of talking about the things in the world around us. Let's get started. So I want you to remember today and every day that I can use what I know about their meanings to compare and convert fractions, decimals, and percents. We'll review the formulas as well, and anyone can use a formula, but if you know what they mean, you'll be able to do these things very easily, even when you don't remember a formula. Let's start by looking at what do fractions, decimals, and percents really mean? Fractions, decimals, and percents are all similar in that they all compare a part with a whole. Now, the difference is what each whole is. Let's take a look. Let's look at the differences between what the whole has to be between fractions, decimals, and percent. With fractions, of course, we have a part as our numerator, and we have our denominator, which is a whole, and that can represent any number. For example, we could have 1/2, but I could also make the numerator 2 or 7 or 38 million. And I could make the denominator also 7 or 38 billion or 236. I can choose any numbers I want to represent what is a whole group and how many parts of that group do I have. Let's move on to decimals. In decimals again have a part and a whole. With decimals, the whole has to be a multiple of 10. And how we know what the whole is where our decimal point is. So if we have a decimal point here and we have a number right after it, we know that those are parts out of tens. So that would be like 1/10 or one piece of it if there's a 1 there. If we had a 2 there, it would mean we had 2 out of 10 or 2/10. Now when I say it can be multiples of 10, we can have tenths. We can also have pieces out of 100. So 0.01 would be 1/100th. 0.02 would be 2/100ths, 0.0003 would be 3,000ths, and so forth and so on. It can go on to infinity. You can have 1/10,000,000th or 50 10,000ths. So as long as it's a multiple of 10, how many parts are in a whole is up to your imagination as long as it's a multiple of 10. Now, last but not least, we have percents. And for percents, we again have a part of a whole, but with percents, the whole is always 100%. So if we have 100 parts, out of 100 parts, we have one whole. If we had, for instance, 50 parts out of 100 parts, then we would have 50 1/100ths, or a half. So let's look at this percent, 73%. That means we have 73 parts out of 100. So now we know that with fractions, decimals, and percents, we are all comparing parts to a whole. We just have different ways of annotating or writing them, and they have different meanings. So let's remember these as we jump forward to some example review problems. So here we have 6 different percentages. I want you to look at these and think in your mind, how many of these can I write an equivalent fraction or an equivalent decimal for? And what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, I want you to get out a piece of paper, and I want you to write these percents down. Then I want you to write down what fraction they would equal and what percent they would equal. I'm going to give you a couple hints. One, some of them have multiple correct answers. And two, if you were able to do a fraction and decimal for each one, that would be 12 possible answers. Just try to see how many you can get. If you can do 1 or 2, that's great. If you can do 5 or 6, awesome. Just see how many you can do. I want you to pause the video right now, write these percentages down as a fraction and a decimal. Go! Welcome back. I hope you found some good answers. Now I want you to check those answers. I have here 2 different ways of checking your answers. First, I think this is the more challenging way. I have all the possible answers and maybe even some false answers right here on a slide. So you can look through these and see if you find any answers that you put for one of the percentages. And if you see something you don't recognize, see if you can match it up and see if it's equivalent to one of the percentages. Also, if you like things to be more organized, I think this is a little bit easier because I have categorized them for you, so you automatically know which ones are fractions, decimals, and percents without thinking about them. But if you like things to be a little bit more organized, you can look at this slide right here. I've listed all the percent problems that I gave you, and then I've listed all the possible options as decimals and fractions. Again, there might be some answers in here that are not correct answers to anything. You don't know. So I want you to pause the video again, go back to one of these 2 slides, either this one where they're all randomly arranged tiles, or this one where they're categorized as percents, fractions, and decimals. I want you to pause the video again, check your answers, and see if you can add any more correct answers to your paper now. Go! Oh, hello, welcome back. Let's check your answers, shall we? Let's look at the first 2 problems, 73% and 70%. Now, as a decimal, we know that 73% means there's 73 parts out of 100. And we know that when there's 100 parts, we have the decimal point and 2 spaces after that. So if we put 73 in there, we would have 73 hundredths, or 0.73. Now, as a fraction, we know that this would be, again, 73% means 73 parts out of 100. So 73 hundredths would be our fraction. Sometimes people get a little confused when they go to 70% because they forget that while 70% is 70 parts out of 100, and therefore, again, if we had our decimal point with 2 places, we would put a 70 there. Sometimes I see muggles just like you make errors where they'll put 0.07 and they will put the 7 in the hundredths place instead of the tenths place. But we know that 70 hundredths is the same as 7 tenths, or 0.7. And as a fraction again, if it's 70 parts out of 100, we would have 70 100ths, but we can simplify this. We can divide the numerator and the denominator both by 10. And remember, if we perform the same operation to the numerator and denominator, it just simplifies the fraction, but we have the same meaning. 70 divided by 10 is 7. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So that fraction simplifies to 7 tenths. Go ahead and pause the video, check your answers. If you got something correct, I want you to go ahead and put a big check on it. If you got something incorrect, I want you to circle it, and then I want you to fix your mistakes, correct your mistakes so you have the correct answers on your paper. Let's go on to the next ones. The next ones I want to go over are 0.5% and 0.09%. So remember that this is parts out of 100. So what this means basically is that I have a half a part out of 100. So I'm going to start with a fraction, and this is what it would look like. 0.5, or half, out of 100. Now, we know that this makes no sense. We cannot have a decimal as the numerator in a fraction. So what we can do is multiply the numerator by 10 and the denominator by 10. Half times 10 is 5. 100 times 10 is 1,000. So this simplifies to 5 thousandths. Of course, we can divide that further because we can divide the numerator by 5 and the denominator by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 100 divided by 5 might seem a little tricky, but if I look at it as 10 divided by 5 is 2, and then I know that the 2 is here in the hundreds place, that means I have 200. So this simplifies to 1/200th. But if we look at it as 5 parts out of 1,000, we can easily convert it to a decimal. We know that these are tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So the 5 would go right here in the thousandths place, and I don't have any tenths or hundredths. So there it is as a decimal. Of course, there is a formula to figure this out. You can see that if you just take the decimal point here, and if you have 0.5%, to convert it from a percent into a decimal, all you have to do is move that decimal point over 2 places, and then you get the same answer, 0.005 or 5/1000ths. It is no longer a percent because we have moved the decimal point. It is now a decimal. However, if you just memorize that formula, you can forget it. If you understand what fractions, decimals, and percents mean, you can solve them yourself at any time. Let's move on to this one. 0.09% or 9/100ths of 1%. If I want to start with my formula method, I can write it out. I can take the decimal point and I can move it to the left 2 spaces. I can erase the percent because I'm converting it from a percent to a decimal. And I get 0.0009 or 9/10,000ths. Let's look at that as a fraction. For 9/10,000ths, my numerator is 9. It's how many I have. And my denominator is 10,000. That's how many parts there are. If I took this chocolate frog and wanted to share it with 10,000 of my friends, but I wanted to have 9 pieces, I could cut this chocolate frog up into 10,000 pieces, and I could keep 9 of those tiny little pieces and eat them. Let's go over the last 2. Let's look at our last 2, shall we? 273%. One of these is larger than 100%, and then the other one has both a full percent and a part of a percent. So let's dive into these. So 273%, we know as a fraction, would be 273 over 100. Now that's an improper fraction because it means we have more than 1 if we have 273 over 100. So what I can do is take out 2 groups of 100 from the numerator. So I took out 2 groups of 100 from the numerator, and those 2 groups of 100, 2 hundreds divided by 100 is 2. So that simplifies into a mixed number as 2 and 73 hundredths. Now as a decimal, that means we have 2 wholes or 2 in the ones place. So I finally get to put something besides a 0 in front of that decimal point. So I have 2 wholes, and then I have 73 out of 100. So I put a 7 in the tenths place and a 3 in the hundredths place, and my decimal is 2.73. Moving on to 3.5. It's like 3% plus a 0.5%. Remember from our last tile that 0.5% was 0.005 or 5/1000ths, and it was 5 over 1,000, and then we simplified that a little bit. So I'm going to think of 3.5% as 3% plus 0.5%. So we know what the 0.5% is from our last problem. As a decimal, we looked back and saw that it is 5/1000ths or 0.005. And as a fraction, we know that it was 5 over 1,000, and that we simplified that to 1 over 200. So now we have to add 3%. We know that in percents, it's parts out of 100. So we would have 3 parts out of 100, 3 hundredths. And as a fraction, we would have 3 over 100. So let's add those together. If we have 5/1000ths and 3 hundredths added together, we would get 35 thousandths. If we want to add 1 200th plus 3 100ths, we need to have a common denominator. So I'm going to double this fraction, which instead of being 3/100 now becomes 3 times 2 is 6, 2 times 100 is 200, 6 200ths plus 1 200th is equal to 7 200ths. So I would get 7 200ths. Let's try this a more conventional way and see if we get the same result. So I just used logic and what I know to convert this to a decimal and a fraction instead of using the formula. And I ended up with a fraction of 7 200ths and a decimal of 0.035 or 35 thousandths. So let's start with the decimal. If I use the formula and I have 3.5%, I move my decimal point over 2 places. I get rid of the percent because I've converted it from a percent into a decimal. I get 0.035, or again, the same answer as I did by adding 3% plus 0.5%, or 35 thousandths. Now let's try this as a fraction. We know that this is parts over 100. 3.5 parts over 100. We know we cannot have a decimal as the numerator in a fraction, so we have to multiply the entire equation, the numerator and the denominator, by 10. 3.5 times 10 is 35. 100 times 10 is 1,000. Now, to simplify that, I can divide 35 and I can divide 1,000 by 5. When I divide the numerator by 5, 35 divided by 5 is 7. When I divide the denominator by 5, 1,000 divided by 5 is 200. So I actually get the same answer that I came up with by solving the problem in 2 different ways. I encourage you to see how many different ways you can come up with to solve these problems when you're converting fractions, decimals, and percents. You are now also a wonderful wizard of math when it comes to converting fractions, decimals, and percents. So today and every day, I want you to remember that you can compare what you know. So today and every day, I want you to remember that you can use what you know about what fractions and decimals and percents mean to compare and convert them. You will remember that they are all comparing a part of something to a whole. They do that in a different way, however. Remember that fractions can have a part and a whole with any value. Any number can be how much you have as the part. Any number can be how much a whole is worth. For decimals, the whole has to be an increment of 10. So you can compare something that has 10 parts, and you're talking about tenths. Something that has 100 parts, you're talking about hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths, 100 thousandths, and so on. But it has to be a multiple of 10. Finally, percents. Percents are always talking about parts out of 100. So when you have more than 100%, something is worth more than one whole, because 100% is a whole. When you have something like my friend here that is less than 100%, 70%, it's less than 1. And if you have something that is less than 1%, like 0.5%, it's going to be smaller than 1/100th. Thank you for joining me today. Your last job is to write one of these problems in the comments below. Choose a fraction, decimal, or percent conversion. And then I want you to find a problem that one of your friends has written, and I want you to solve that problem. So write a problem in the comments down below, and then also solve another problem that somebody else has created. Thank you for joining me.